Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, get ready for this one, because today we are diving into a story that's just packed with surprises, twists, and turns.
I know, right?
The Cuban-American experience in the U.S. I mean, we're talking about a group that went from being political refugees to being, well, called a model minority, a term that, sounds all positive, but we'll get into it. It's got a lot more to it. And what makes this whole thing, this deep dive, I think, so fascinating is that we're going to uncover how, a single historical event, the Cold War, dramatically just, reshaped their destiny.
Right.
And for this one, we are looking at a truly in-depth, it's long history podcast episode transcript.
Yes, so much good stuff in there.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how the Cold War really set the stage for this whole Cuban-American story. Think about it, that first big wave of Cuban immigrants, we're talking something like 250,000 people. They arrived in the U.S. between, right at the peak of Cold War tensions.
Oh, wow.
1959 and 1962. So they weren't just, typical immigrants looking for a better life, the classic story. These people were fleeing Fidel Castro's communist regime.
So their arrival in the U.S. wasn't just about, like you said, personal stuff. It became this huge symbolic victory for the U.S. in the fight against communism.
Right.
Just their presence here was this statement against Castro and a testament to, America, democracy, all that.
Exactly. And the U.S. government, they weren't just sitting back and watching this happen. They were very active. They saw these Cuban exiles as valuable assets in their propaganda war against communism.
Yeah.
Journalist and historian Juan Gonzalez, he argues in his book, it's called Harvest of Empire, that the U.S. government, they went above and beyond to support these exiles. They were providing financial aid, housing assistance, even job training. That's a level of support. You don't see that very often, do you?
No, it's true. It really does seem like they've kind of rolled out the red carpet, which makes you wonder, was it just, pure altruism, or was it this strategic move, to showcase hey, look how great the American system is? But there's another layer to this story, too.
Yes, definitely.
It wasn't just about the whole Cold War politics. This first wave, their demographics played a big role in how they were received and integrated into American society.
Absolutely. So this first wave of Cubans, they were, predominantly white, they were well-educated, and they came from a relatively affluent background.
Okay.
Which is a stark contrast to other Latino groups arriving around the same time, who often faced, more prejudice and struggled more economically, let's be honest.
So are we saying that because of their background, it was kind of easier for them to assimilate, achieve success? Is that why they're often held up as this, shining example of the quote-unquote model minority, even though that label might be, a little misleading?
It's a tough question, right? It's hard to deny that their demographics played a role in how smoothly they integrated. They weren't seen as a threat, and their skills and education were seen as positives to the American economy. In fact, the transcript mentions this really compelling story about this Cuban exile who arrived in Miami with practically nothing, just his engineering degree.
Oh, wow.
And he was able to get government assistance, started his own construction firm, and eventually, this is amazing, he became a major player in the city's development boom.
Wow. Talk about resilience and seizing an opportunity when you see it. But it does make you wonder if those same opportunities would have been there for someone from, a different background,
right?
Even if they had the same drive and the same skills. It really highlights how success is often tied to things that are beyond just individual effort.
It definitely complicates this, American ideal of a totally meritocratic society. But even with these advantages they had, it's important to acknowledge, these people worked hard.
Yeah.
They had a real entrepreneurial spirit.
Right.
The transcript highlights how many Cuban exiles took those initial opportunities and they built something remarkable. By the 1980s, they were surpassing other Latino groups.
Wow.
And even the national average in things like education and income.
So let's get into those numbers. What kind of statistical evidence do we have for their economic success?
All right, well, by 1980, about 16% of Cuban Americans had completed 4 years of college, which is, think about this, more than 3 times the rate for Mexican Americans.
Wow.
And almost triple the rate for Puerto Ricans at that time.
Yeah.
And it didn't stop there. By 1990, that figure had jumped to over 20% for Cuban Americans.
Okay.
Which was double the rate for Latinos overall.
Yeah, that's a huge difference.
So it paints a really clear picture of upward mobility.
those are impressive numbers. And what about their income? Did all that education translate into real economic gains?
Absolutely. By 1989, the average Cuban-American income was almost $28,000, which was a little bit below the national average at the time. It was like $29,000, but it was significantly higher than the average Latino income, which was, I think, about $22,000.
Right.
So this data, clearly shows that they were making some major economic strides.
Okay, so we're seeing them climbing that socioeconomic ladder,
Mm-hmm.
but they weren't content with just, personal success, were they? The transcript mentions like a strong sense of political activism within the community.
Yeah.
Driven by their desire to see Castro's regime, gone.
Right, and it makes sense when you think about where they came from, right?
Yeah.
They came from this intensely political environment. Many of them had lost property, businesses, loved ones because of Castro's policies. So this fueled this burning desire to see a free Cuba.
So how did they actually channel this passion? Did they hit the streets, lobby politicians, or were there more, organized efforts going on?
Well, it was a little bit of everything. They formed all sorts of anti-Castro organizations. They staged protests. They engaged in lobbying efforts. One example from the transcript that really stands out is this nationwide boycott of businesses that were trading with Cuba.
Oh.
It was a powerful move.
Yeah.
It showed their economic and political clout and this determination to influence U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba.
They really were using every tool at their disposal to put pressure on the Castro regime. And as their numbers grew, their political influence obviously grew right alongside it.
Exactly.
But I'm curious about something. Did their political activism change at all as they became, more integrated into American society?
That's a really interesting question. And it leads us to, I think, a pivotal moment in their political evolution, which is the surge in naturalization rates among Cuban-Americans.
Yeah.
Did you know that, get this, between 1971 and 1980, 80%, a full 80%
Wow.
of all U.S. naturalizations were by Cubans. Compare that to, I think it was just 6% for Mexicans during the same period.
Wow, 80%. That's a huge, huge difference. It seems like they were really eager to become citizens and actively participate in the American political system.
Right.
Not just as a voting bloc, but as elected officials.
Exactly. And that growing political power, well, it led to some really incredible milestones. For instance, in 1985, Xavier Suarez was elected as the first Cuban-American mayor of Miami.
Wow.
It was a symbolic victory, showing their rising dominance in South Florida politics.
Yeah.
And then, in 1989, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, she became the first Latina ever elected to Congress, which was a huge moment. It shattered a long-standing barrier in U.S. politics.
Incredible achievements marking their transition from exiles to, powerful players in the American political landscape. But as we'll see, their journey wasn't all smooth sailing.
No, it wasn't.
A whole new wave of Cuban immigrants was about to arrive, one that would, challenge this whole narrative of seamless success and add, a new layer of complexity to the Cuban-American experience.
Yeah, and that's where things get even more interesting. Stay tuned. We're going to dive into the impact of the Mariel Boatlift and everything that came after it in part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back. So last time we were exploring how, Cold War politics and this unique set of demographics really kind of propelled that first wave of Cuban exiles to, pretty remarkable success.
Yeah.
But their story, it takes a sharp turn.
Yeah, it does.
In 1980, with the Mariel Boatlift.
Yeah.
And this is an event that would, really challenge this existing Cuban-American community and just reveal, I think, how complicated immigration and assimilation can be.
The Mariel Boatlift really throws a wrench into that, simple narrative of the model minority.
Yeah.
Remember, that first wave was largely welcomed, open arms, seen as these hardworking, educated people fleeing communism.
Right.
But in the spring of 1980, Castro, he suddenly allows any Cuban who wants to leave to depart from the port of Mariel.
And something like over 124,000 Cubans took that opportunity, right?
It's an incredible number.
To make that risky journey across the Florida Straits.
Yeah.
And often in, really overcrowded and dangerous boats.
Exactly. And unlike those earlier exiles,
yeah,
the Marielitos, as they came to be called, they were much more diverse.
Okay.
Many were black or mixed race, less affluent.
Right.
And some had criminal records or struggled with, mental health issues.
So that's a big shift in demographics.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, did this change in perception? From this ideal refugee to this more, complex and maybe even, less desirable group influence how they were received in the U.S.?
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. government, I mean, they were under pressure from, a less welcoming public and facing a recession at the time.
Oh, wow.
They didn't grant the Marielitos the same refugee status as the earlier exiles.
Really?
So this meant they didn't get the same level of support, no automatic financial aid, housing assistance, job training. They were pretty much left to figure it out on their own.
It feels almost like a bait and switch,
Yeah, man.
The earlier exiles are being, actively supported and integrated.
Right.
And then the Marielitos are met with suspicion and very limited resources.
That's right.
It's hard not to see like a double standard there, especially when you consider the economic climate.
No, you're absolutely right. The U.S. was in the middle of an economic downturn. Jobs were scarce.
Yeah.
And this just fueled anxieties about, competition for jobs, especially in Florida, where most of the Marielitos landed,
right,
which already had a sizable Cuban population.
So you have this like influx of new arrivals, many of whom are struggling during a time of, economic uncertainty.
Yeah.
It's easy to see how that could breed tension and resentment even within the Cuban-American community itself.
And that's exactly what happened. Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva, he argues that that preferential treatment that first wave got actually created a hierarchy within the Cuban-American community.
Oh, wow.
Which, set the stage for conflict. The earlier exiles who they'd worked so hard to establish themselves.
Right.
They were now worried about being, lumped in with this new wave.
Yeah.
Facing economic competition from them and potentially having their, hard-won success undermined.
So even within, a single ethnic group, you can have these internal divisions and power dynamics.
Oh, for sure.
It complicates this idea of like, a single monolithic Cuban-American experience.
Right.
But the tension wasn't just within the Cuban community, though, was it? The Mariel Boatlift also kind of like, stirred up existing racial tensions in Florida.
Yeah.
Particularly between, Black communities and the new arrivals.
Sadly, you're right. Fewer jobs to go around.
Yeah.
And many in the Black community, they felt that the Marielitos, even without official refugee status, were getting preferential treatment.
Oh, wow.
Which just, fueled resentment and mistrust.
It's that classic, it happens over and over again, economic anxieties being, twisted and channeled into racial animosity. Yeah.
Often with devastating consequences. And the situation in Florida was already, it was tense.
Oh, yeah.
We can't forget, there's this whole history of racial segregation and discrimination that Black communities had been facing for generations.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. And the arrival of the Marielitos just, it tapped into these existing fault lines.
Right.
In fact, the transcript mentions, a really chilling example of this tension boiling over. The 1980 Liberty City Riots in Miami.
Oh, yeah.
These riots, they started because of the acquittal of white police officers in the death of a Black motorist. But they were fueled by, years of frustration and a sense of being, like, pushed aside in their own city.
It's tragic how the arrival of one group can be seen as a threat to the well-being of another, especially when resources are scarce and there's this history of inequality.
Yeah, it shows that immigration is never just about the individual stories,
Right.
It's about how those arrivals impact the communities that are already there and the fabric of the whole country.
Right.
And this backlash, it wasn't just like, on the street. It showed up in politics too, didn't it?
It did. Just a few months after those Liberty City riots, Florida voters, they repealed a 1973 bilingual bicultural ordinance.
Oh, wow.
Which a lot of people saw as a direct response to the influx of, Spanish-speaking Marielitos.
Yeah.
And it reflected this growing, you could call it nativist sentiment.
Yeah.
And a pushback against the growing Hispanic presence in the state.
So it's like the state was kind of closing ranks, becoming less welcoming.
Yeah.
This repeal, it wasn't just symbolic. It had real consequences for the Marielitos, like how they were able to integrate,
Oh, without a doubt. It sent this message, you're not fully welcome here.
Right.
Imagine trying to navigate a new country, find work, access basic services, when even the language of government is now restricted.
Right.
It created these huge barriers to integration and assimilation.
So for facing, limited support, economic hardship, and just like a less than welcoming social environment, what happened to the Marielitos?
Yeah.
Were they able to overcome all of that?
Their story is, it's really one of incredible resilience. Despite all of those obstacles, they managed to make a life for themselves.
Wow.
It wasn't easy. It took time. But by the 1990s, their college attendance rates, they were on par with those earlier waves of Cuban immigrants.
That's incredible. What factors contributed to this, I don't know, turnaround? Was it just, pure grit and determination, or were there other things going on?
It was a few things. Historian Vicky Ruiz, she emphasizes the role of community networks.
Okay.
She argues that those earlier waves of Cuban exiles, despite that initial hesitation and tension,
Right.
they ended up playing a crucial role in supporting the Marielitos.
Oh, wow.
They had established churches, businesses, cultural organizations, mutual aid societies,
Yeah.
all of which provided like a safety net and a sense of belonging.
Yeah. So despite that initial friction, that sense of, shared heritage and recognizing that their struggles were kind of intertwined, that helped bridge the gap between these different waves of Cuban immigrants.
Yes, exactly. And the Marielitos also, they benefited from their own resourcefulness and that entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah.
Many of them found work in the informal economy, starting small businesses or finding niches where their skills were needed.
So it really shows their adaptability
Yeah.
and their determination to make a life for themselves, even when, things were stacked against them. But their arrival and the backlash that followed, it really forced, I don't know, like a reckoning, both within the Cuban-American community and in American society more broadly.
Yeah.
It just blew apart this myth of, the single perfect immigrant experience.
Right.
And revealed the complexities of race, class, assimilation.
And that's what makes this whole Cuban-American story so compelling, right?
Yeah.
It's not just this simple tale of triumph. It's about resilience, adaptation, and constantly negotiating like identity and belonging in a country that's, grappling with its own contradictions.
So as we head into the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
let's revisit this whole model minority idea and really examine, does it actually apply to the Cuban-American experience?
Yeah.
Has their success, which they achieved against a lot of odds, come at a cost?
Good question.
And what can we learn from their journey about how complicated immigration, assimilation, and the pursuit of this, American dream really are?
Okay, so we've seen the highs, we've seen the lows of the Cuban-American experience from, that Cold War arrival to all the upheaval of the Mariel Boatlift.
Right.
And now I think it's time to tackle a question that seems to, follow them around.
Yeah.
That whole model minority myth. Is it a fitting label, or does it kind of mask a much more, complicated reality?
It's a good question, and it's worth spending some time on because that model minority myth, it's tricky. It's like a double-edged sword.
Okay. On the surface, it looks like it's celebrating a group's achievements. Right? High education levels, strong work ethic, economic success.
Yeah.
But it's often used to pit minority groups against each other.
Right.
Implying that if you haven't achieved that same level of success, you just haven't tried hard enough.
Like, look, they did it, why can't you?
Yeah, exactly.
But that ignores all the historical context, the systemic barriers,
Right.
the unique challenges that different groups face.
Right. Everyone's story is different.
It creates this, unrealistic expectation and a false sense of competition.
Exactly. And that whole model minority myth,
Right.
it often overlooks the struggles, the sacrifices within those groups that are supposedly so successful.
Right.
It creates this single image erasing all the diversity of experiences and challenges within that community.
So applying that to Cuban-Americans, we've seen how they've achieved some remarkable things.
They have.
But it's not, a straight line to success, their story.
Yeah.
Their early success was so heavily influenced by, like we talked about, Cold War politics and government support that, other Latino groups just didn't get.
Right. And let's not forget the Mariel Boatlift.
Right.
Which really highlighted those divisions and struggles within the Cuban-American community.
Exactly. The Marielitos, they faced a lot of discrimination, economic hardship.
Yeah.
Their path to success was much harder than those who came before.
Much harder.
So to say that all Cuban-Americans are a model minority, it's not only inaccurate, it's dismissive of all the different experiences within the community.
Totally. It's like trying to fit, a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
It's a reductionist label that, simplifies things way too much. And it's especially problematic when you're talking about a group like Cuban-Americans whose success is so tied to, specific historical and political events.
Their success is undeniable.
It is.
But attributing it all to, cultural values or just, hard work, it ignores the real impact of U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
The timing of their arrival, even their racial demographics.
All of that plays a role.
Yeah.
The Cuban-American experience, it reminds us that there's no single formula for immigrant success.
Right.
It's this mix of individual effort, historical context, and systemic factors.
Yeah.
And their journey, I mean, it really speaks to their resilience, that entrepreneurial spirit, the strength of their community networks.
Yeah.
But it's also a story that challenges those simple narratives we hear about immigration and the American dream.
It's like we've, peeled back the layers of this, success story. And we've found something much richer, more complex.
Absolutely.
This tapestry, woven with struggle, adaptation, and just, I don't know, this constant figuring out of identity and belonging.
It's fascinating how the Cuban-American experience makes us really think about those assumptions we have about assimilation and belonging. They've held on to this strong sense of their own culture,
Yeah.
but they've also achieved economic and political success here.
Right.
It challenges this idea that, to assimilate, you have to totally abandon your cultural heritage.
Yeah, it's more like a merging, I guess.
Yeah, like a fusion.
Yeah.
Blending cultures and traditions, creating something totally new, uniquely Cuban-American.
And it makes me wonder, how has this community navigated the, American political scene? Especially with, their history with Castro's Cuba.
Yeah.
Have they, I don't know, leaned toward one side or the other?
It's a question that political scientists are still debating. While those early Cuban exiles were very anti-communist, aligned with conservative politics,
Right.
later generations, they've been more diverse in their political views.
Okay.
Their voting patterns are influenced by, things like age, socioeconomic status, their own personal experiences with U.S. policies toward Cuba.
So even within, what seems like this, kind of homogenous community, there's a whole spectrum of political views.
Oh, absolutely.
Shaped by individual experiences and generational shifts. It's not one big block. It's this vibrant, evolving community that's hard to, I don't know, put in a box.
Definitely not a monolith.
Yeah.
And that's what makes their story so relevant today,
Yeah.
The Cuban-American experience gives us these valuable insights into how complicated immigration is, assimilation, and just what it means to be American, which is always changing.
Yeah.
Their journey makes us think critically about that model minority myth
Right.
and really appreciate all the different layers of each person's immigrant experience.
It's been, I don't know, it's been a journey, this one, exploring all the twists and turns of the Cuban-American experience, right?
It does.
I feel like we've debunked some myths,
Definitely.
uncovered some complexities, and I think gained a deeper understanding of their, remarkable journey.
Yeah, for sure.
But the conversation doesn't stop here, right?
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, if we zoom out a bit, the Cuban-American story raises these big questions about the future of immigrant communities in the U.S. How do we make sure everyone has the same opportunities, no matter their background? How do we create a society that embraces diversity without falling back on stereotypes or harmful rhetoric? And how can we learn from both the successes and the challenges of communities like the Cuban-Americans to create a more inclusive and just future for everyone?
Those are questions worth thinking about.
They are.
And I encourage you to keep exploring this topic.
Yeah.
Seek out different perspectives and, challenge your own assumptions.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Cuban-American experience.
Yes. Thank you.
We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.